What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my new player's guide for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, specifically ahead of the console release. I thought it was a good time to sort of compile all of the information and some of the videos I've made over several years, actually, about the systems of Wrath of the Righteous and just common questions that people new to the game will ask. So, to that end, at the start of this video, I want to mention a couple of things. For starters, while this will be a pretty thorough video, it will not cover everything. Pathfinder is gigantic, and there is, simply put, a lot to know. So, as long as this video winds up being, it is not all of the information by any means, but it is what I think is the most useful stuff to know as a new player trying to jump in for the first time, or just looking to get better at the system in general. Secondly, typically speaking, when I make videos, I record everything all at once and then edit it all down. This helps with a few different things, namely like making your voice sound consistent across a video. However, this particular video will be recorded and edited across multiple sessions. I might actually use old footage and voice where it's actually still relevant, for instance, as this video is going to be quite long. So to that end, if you hear any variations in my voice or exact wordings about certain things, that is most likely what is going on. Now, to kick off this new player guide, we are going to start with none other than the difficulty settings. Because if you know anything about Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, a great deal of all of the information around the game honestly does depend on what difficulty you are trying to play the game on. So that's where we're going to start. First things first, we are going to spend a decent amount of time on this screen right here. I will try to show some more in-game examples of actual things happening. However, by the very nature of the game, Pathfinder is really a game of numbers more than anything else. It's a lot of dice rolls and things behind the scenes. And once you kind of understand how that stuff works and you understand that information, that's going to help you a lot more than actually just seeing me in real time hit things. However, I will be giving some in-game examples of some of these numbers and things changing towards the end of the video. However, a lot of our time is going to be spent in this screen right here, kind of explaining a lot of this text, because new players might see some of these options and not even have any idea what this actually means. So that's where we're going to start, because of course, if you clicked on a video like this, chances are you're probably at least newer to the game, or you just need some help, etc., etc. So I want to start this off by saying there are 7 presets, and then there's a custom setting. So the 7 presets are story, casual, normal, daring, core, hard, and unfair. And then of course, custom. Custom, meaning that any of these options with the little bar next to them on the left here, all of these will affect your difficulty. Changing them in different ways will set it to custom. There are 13 different options here. Some of them do more than others. There are also options towards the bottom that will change your gameplay experience, but don't really affect the difficulty per se. For instance, turning the Crusade on auto mode just means you don't have to deal with the Crusade management, whereas Last Aslanti, it turns it into an Iron Man mode, basically. And then there's other options for controlling your experience gains and things like that. Before we jump into the differences here, I just want to mention that at the end of the day, this is a game that you paid for, and as such, you can enjoy it in any which way you please. There are those people who are going to tell you that playing on story mode isn't actually playing the game, but I'm here to tell you as somebody who does this for a living, if you want to enjoy something you've paid for and turn it on story mode, go crazy. There's nothing wrong with just enjoying a game for what it is without trying to deal with crazy hard difficulties where you just have to reload a million times. And as someone who 100%s these games and actually beats them on their highest difficulty, outside of the personal enjoyment of the challenge, it really doesn't add much to the game. But let's talk about what these things actually do. At the very top of the list, we have critical hits. Critical hits can be divided up into off, weak, or normal. Off, of course, means your party just straight up will not take critical hits. You can still deal critical hits to your enemies, however, your party will not take critical hits. Weak means that you can take critical hits, however, damage bonuses are not multiplied. What does that mean? Basically, it just means that if you take a critical hit, the only damage that gets multiplied, thus giving you more damage from the critical hit, is the weapon damage of the attack, or the base damage of the attack, I should say. This means that the damage bonuses a creature might have won't be added on top of it. So, for instance, if that creature gets a bonus to its strength or from any other source that isn't its weapon, it doesn't get multiplied on top of the critical hit, which by itself makes them deal significantly less damage. And then we have, of course, normal. This just means your party takes the full damage from the critical hit. Then we have Death's Door. Death's Door is a condition that keeps your characters from dying right off the bat. But real quick, to explain unconsciousness and actual death in-game, if your character goes into negative hit points, they might not necessarily be dead. If they get brought to 0, they might go unconscious, or even a little below 0, they might still just be considered unconscious. However, once your character takes damage in the negative amount equal to your Constitution score or lower, that character would be then considered dead. But with Death's Door active, you'll actually get a condition called Death's Door, which is basically like a free death. Now, you won't like magically pop up or anything until after combat, but this will keep you from having to resurrect that character. That said, some conditions will just straight out kill a character without triggering Death's Door. That does happen, but for the most part, this is basically a free death before that character actually dies, kind of giving you some room to maneuver. Death's Door is usually removed by resting at a safe place, such as a town hub. If you're playing on a difficulty where this is not turned on, if your character hits death, they just straight up die, and then you have to resurrect them by buying a resurrect scroll in town, which is very expensive. Well, expensive at first. It gets pretty cheap late game. Now, we have Dead Companions rise after combat. This is pretty straightforward. However, it does interact in interesting ways with Death's Door. So with Dead Companions rise after combat turned on, your companions and you will actually never die. So the Dead Companions part is a little misleading. You will only ever become unconscious. Now that said, the game will still end if all of your characters go unconscious. However, they will never die, and thus they won't trigger Death's Door. They'll actually just get up after combat and you don't even have to deal with the Death's Door condition. So there's kind of a weird little bit of interplay with Death's Door and Dead Companions rise after combat. Remove negative effects on rest is pretty much straightforward, kind of does exactly what it says it does. But basically anything that would normally require a spell of some sort to heal is just automatically removed on resting. That is to say, blindness, which normally requires a spell or a scroll to cure, ability damage, which has to be cured by either restoration or potentially rest, kind of depending on the exact nature of the ability damage and its source. But a lot of that will be cured with resting if this is turned on. And then we have remove controlling effects after combat. This is things that cause loss of control for your character, such as frightened, paralyzed, etc. If this is on, that stuff will just end shortly after combat and basically keep you from having to deal with it. And that brings us to auto level up. Now, some interesting things to note about auto level up. The game will only auto level up a base class. So companions can be auto leveled up because they start with just a base class or a specific build in mind that the developers made. However, for you and the all possible option, it only applies for the base class. So if you are playing an archetype, there is no preset build for that, and thus the game can't auto-level you up. Starting at like Daring, I think this actually gets turned off besides companions, and you'll actually have to level up yourself. But if you're new to the game, this can be especially useful if you're not really sure what works well with other things, or you don't have like a specific build in mind and you just kind of want to play this type of class. Auto level up can do you some favors. And then we have the single most important part of the difficulty settings, and that is enemy stat adjustments. Put it very simply, enemy stat adjustments affects basically everything in game by adjusting the difficulty class of every role in the game. Now, this primarily affects the enemies, however, it will affect other things as well, such as your DC checks in combat, such as your DC checks in dialogue, things like your mobility checks, your athletics checks, all that kind of stuff that might happen outside of actual combat, be it dialogue or interacting with the world. However, it also affects enemies. That is to say, it greatly affects their ability to deal damage and take damage, meaning that it will affect their armor class, which makes them easier or harder to hit, as well as affecting their ability to hit you by adjusting their attack rolls, their spell checks, like all that kind of stuff that they have to perform also gets adjusted with this. Damage to party is pretty straightforward. 1.0 is considered 100% regular damage. Pretty much go from there. You can raise it up to 3 times the normal amount of damage. Unfair only raises it to double damage. Then we have number of enemies. This comes in standard and increased. Only 3 difficulties have increased enemies normally. That is core, hard, and unfair. The interesting thing to note about the increased amount of enemies actually though, is that you will actually get more experience with this turned on because you're killing more things and you get experience per enemy killed. This was actually adjusted a bit during the beta so it doesn't get outrageous or anything. But on core and above, you will actually level a little bit faster if you're paying attention because you are killing more things and thus actually getting more experience. And of course, on harder difficulties, this becomes harder to deal with as those enemies will of course have higher DCs on top of the fact that there's just straight up more of them. Then we have additional enemy behaviors. Now you might think this might start turning on it like daring, however you'd be wrong. In fact, if you play on core or something and you notice enemies doing a lot more stuff, it's actually not that they're doing more stuff, it's just that the stuff they are doing is actually hitting you. Because additional enemy behaviors only gets turned on once you hit hard mode. And this will allow them to do other stuff like cast different spells, etc. and use different tactics, that kind of thing. But again, it's worth mentioning that this is only in effect on hard and unfair mode. And that in core mode, you'll get hit with a lot of different stuff because the enemies are able to actually hit you with spells they were using. And then we have party speed. This is pretty straightforward. There's an encumbrance effect on your characters as well as your total party stash. It is light, medium, heavy, and overloaded. This affects your actual travel speed with this turned on, which is pretty normal. So you have to actually manage your inventory, basically. And then we have weather effects. This is probably, of all of them, the least brought up. It comes in light or heavy, and basically when it's storming, if you have heavy on, you'll actually start taking some detriments to your character depending on the exact weather. However, this is pretty easily mitigated by just resting through it and, coming back when it's not storming, basically. And then we have enable character retrain. Anything above normal actually turns respecs off. If this is on, the same character that you buy mercenaries from will be able to retrain your character or your companions, etc. Anything above normal actually turns this off, meaning you're actually stuck with your decisions, which is fairly important. Now, let's jump into some of the differences between the actual presets. Right off the bat, I recommend a new player, like completely new to the game, either play on casual or normal. If you want to play on story, go ahead. But the problem with story mode is, because of the way this game works, you can find yourself often not actually learning the mechanics because you're not having to see them or deal with them, because story mode turns a lot of that stuff just off altogether. And because of that, if you actually want to learn at the game and get better in the future, I recommend starting on casual or normal. Casual, you're going to have 40% damage from enemies, which means you're taking less than half of their actual damage. The enemies themselves will have reduced DCs, making them much easier to hit. It's going to be easier to pass your checks. You will not take critical hits. You can auto level up, and effects will be removed upon rest. And then on normal, there's actually a bit of a big jump between casual and normal. Because on normal, you're going to take 80% damage from monsters, weak critical hits, and while the enemies still have reduced DCs, they are increased from casual. And when you rest, effects aren't necessarily removed. So if your character was blinded, you're going to have to cure that with a remove blindness spell or a scroll. And then we have daring. Daring is when things actually start changing pretty drastically. So on daring is the difficulty where you're actually going to start taking full damage from monsters. You cannot respec. And the DCs from enemies in the game are just barely reduced. Technically still below the tabletop rules, but reduced nonetheless. And then we have core. Core is like the actual Pathfinder rules, or at least as close as this game adapts them as possible. So you're going to take full damage from crits. Enemies get all of the normal DCs that are associated with what they do. There is no auto level up, so you have to know what you're doing. And this is the first difficulty that actually starts using the increased enemies. You will take extra effects from weather. There is no death's door at this point, so on core, once your characters die, they're just dead, and you have to resurrect them, provided you don't just reload, of course. And you'll start being affected by party speed. That is to say, the weight you're carrying will start affecting your party speed. And then we have hard. We have basically core, except the enemy gets the extra abilities and things we talked about, as well as getting bonuses to their difficulty checks. And then we have unfair. From hard, it doubles the damage you're taking, so you go from full damage to double damage, and the enemies have the absolute max amount of DCs possible. So what all of this ultimately means is that the higher you go, the more difficult enemies are to hit, and the fact that they do more damage. You might be thinking, duh, obviously that is what that means. However, I will say hard and unfair are exactly that more than anything else. But at that point, it starts being more about RNG if you have a solid character build. Because, for instance, a min-max build can still fail on hard and unfair if they simply get unlucky with dice rolls. Technically, that can happen on core as well. If you have a very well-built character, core and below, you'll be okay most of the time. However, you still, of course, might just get unlucky because it happens. But on hard and unfair, a lot of times it comes down to min-maxed characters also getting lucky with their rolls. So you can know exactly what you're doing and still fail on hard and unfair simply because you don't get the dice rolls to make it happen. All right, now that we've got all of that out of the way, I want to start talking about some of the key differences between difficulties. So we're going to take a look at a situation on normal and then on unfair difficulty. So right now we are on normal. At the start of this fight, we can see that we have this boss right here as well as a few enemies to fight. Now this is just on normal. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 ghouls that we can see, as well as the boss itself. Now if we hit Y to inspect, we can actually check out its actual armor class and stuff. On normal mode, this boss has an armor class of 27, a flat-footed armor class of 23, a touch AC of 12, and it also has several other defenses that are saves against other types of attacks such as spells. So that's Fortitude, Reflex, and Will. Now the main thing to look out for in a lot of ways is AC. Honestly, knowing all of this is important, but we're going to start with AC. Basically, AC is your chance to hit something or what you would have to roll to actually hit it. Now, regular AC is basically just a regular attack against that target. I would have to roll a 27 on a regular attack to actually hit it with an attack roll. That's not how much damage I'll do, mind you, but in order to even hit the thing, I have to roll an attack roll of 27 or more. Then we have flat-footed AC. This means an AC where that target has been denied its dexterity bonus for some reason. Be it that that monster has been paralyzed or it's been flanked or something like that, where basically how dexterous that monster is isn't able to help it out. And then we have touch AC. Touch AC is basically an AC where really all you need to do is be able to touch the target. Even if it is capable of blocking it, you're still touching it. So that's kind of what the touch AC is all about. And it is why it is significantly lower than normal for most attacks. And why building a build around hitting something's touch AC can be very effective because it is typically much lower than their regular AC. On normal, again, 4 ghouls, 27 AC, and you kind of see it all there. So let's look at this same fight, but on unfair difficulty. Okay, so now we're on unfair difficulty. We can note some immediate changes. One, we have about double the amount of enemies here, plus there are other enemy types. We see a Huntsmaster, as well as some creepers, and just general variety to the ghouls themselves, but mostly that there's double the amount now. And then if we look at the boss itself, and again, Y to inspect, will bring up what your character knows about that enemy. You have to make various types of knowledge checks to get this information, so you may or may not be able to see this, but if you're ever curious about what the defenses of an enemy are, pause it, press Y, mouse over that enemy. But here on unfair difficulty, we can see that this enemy's AC has basically doubled. It's now 43, its flat-footed AC is 39, and its touch AC is 28. Its various saving throw defenses have basically doubled. And that's kind of what you're looking at with the differences between, for starters, obviously, just normal and unfair. But you can kind of see this as you go from casual or all the way up to unfair or any difficulty, really. And this is really what you're looking at when it comes to making builds, is going to the appropriate difficulty setting that you want to try and basically just testing your build against various ACs at various levels. So I might build a character that, for instance, is specifically trying to hit touch AC, which might make it a little easier to hit things. But on unfair difficulty, when you're looking at ACs that high, in general, it can be very difficult to hit things, period, because even a min-maxed build is going to have a decent chance to just miss. And this isn't even taking into account the fact that enemies are going to be using other abilities. They're going to be successfully using their regular abilities now that they have their appropriate or possibly increased DCs. And I'm just going to straight up be fighting more enemies, which means tactics become more of a thing. Now, if we mouse over these guys, they also have a decent amount of AC and defenses and things. This is, again, where tactics become important. Now, the group I'm running really isn't set up for this, but crowd control, if you can manage it, as well as just min-maxed builds that are designed to get as much chance as possible to actually hit something, which, again, on unfair, they still might miss, are really the name of the game. So, off the top of my head, I might try to get this fight or this group of enemies with a attack like Spiked Pit or something like that will actually just swallow up most of these enemies and keeps them crowd controlled for a hot minute. But that is going to require them to fail a reflex save, which means they're going to get to roll a d20 plus use their plus 12 reflex save to potentially get away from my create pit. So even that is going to be genuinely more difficult. And that's why unfair can be such a pain, because it's really about just getting lucky with dice rolls a lot of the time. There's a lot more RNG involved. even when you are in fact min-maxing. Because something to understand about min-maxed builds is theoretical damage does not equal actual damage. Just because something is capable of hitting like 500-600 damage, which isn't unheard of, it does not, by any stretch of the imagination, mean you're actually going to do that every time. So in my personal experience, having beaten Kingmaker on unfair difficulty, as well as playing this game pretty extensively, what it really comes down to is honestly just reloading fights a ton until you either get better rolls or just get lucky. And again, that's on top of min-maxing your builds, because build viability is very much so a thing in the Pathfinder universe, where it is absolutely possible to get destroyed. Now, this is just a build I was kind of running through getting footage for before the game was even released, actually. This is the build I did some of the review content with. And if you want, you can see the team here get absolutely destroyed. As you can see, I died there in seconds. And that is because, in addition to all of their ACs and stuff making them harder to hit, they are dealing double damage. They are getting better rolls and bonuses and difficulty modifiers to hit me. And again, a lot of it can come down to just min-max builds on top of luck of the draw. All right, guys. From here, I want to talk about character creation. Now, again, I want to emphasize I am not covering everything. For instance, we're not going to go into the classes in a great amount of detail individually. My goal here is to help you understand the decisions you're making and kind of point you in the right direction, as this is a new player's guide. If we went into extreme detail with every class, quite frankly, it would add hours to this video at the bare minimum. But what I am going to do is walk you through screen by screen and kind of explain what you're looking at. Now, the very first page that will come up is the new character pre-generation screen, if you will. There are 6 characters in the game that are pre-generated characters. Basically, if you don't know what to do, the devs threw in some pre-gens here that you can pick as a default, if you will. And they kind of give some helpful pie graphs here to kind of show you what each individual build is actually good at. Assuming you don't want to use a pre-generated character, you of course can pick on custom character down here. Then once we hit next, you can pick a portrait. Now you can actually pick from even the old Kingmaker portraits as well. They've added quite a bit of these just to the game that you can pick. So even old Kingmaker characters and companions are options, or you can pick some of the new ones, or you can pick a custom one as long as you put the appropriate image files in one of the game folders. You can upload your own custom portraits, but for now we'll pick just the first one here because I don't really care that much. Now let's talk about the class screen and what we are actually looking at. So this is where a lot of new players will get overwhelmed because there's just so much going on. For starters, in total, if you include the prestige classes, there's like 40-something classes to choose from. However, you can only pick one of the base classes at the start. Everything down at the bottom in red is what is called a prestige class. This simply means that these classes have prerequisites before you can actually take levels in them. If you are familiar with D&D, the leveling system here works much the same way. Every time you level, you effectively get a class point to spend in one of the classes available to you. That will then give you that appropriate level in that class. So you can multi-class by simply putting levels into other classes, provided you of course meet the requirements. Now, anytime you pick on an actual class here, you will notice 6 little sub-options. These are your archetypes. These are a bit different from D&D's subclasses in that an archetype usually trades a positive for a negative in some way. That's not necessarily universally true, but that's the gist. So that's what you're actually looking at here. Now, again, much like the pre-generated characters, we can see what each individual class is supposed to be good at, as well as a sort of difficulty indication of how much goes into playing them. Now, unsurprisingly, if you're a new player, what's typically best is to pick a character with a low difficulty rating. Slayer, for instance, is a very effective melee character that is very easy to play, so for a new player, it's highly recommendable. Or you could pick something like a ranger, which can do melee or ranged, obviously, and has a slight bit more going on, but is still overall very simple. Or you could pick something like Kineticists. Kineticists are a personal favorite class of mine, but they have a lot of very unique mechanics that don't really apply to any other class. I actually made an entire video about playing specifically Kineticists that was like 30 minutes long, if my memory serves. It's not overly complicated, it's just very specific knowledge, and there's a lot of instances like that in Pathfinder. So, as obviously just the most bare bones advice one could give you, is to pick a class with a lower difficulty indicator if you're genuinely new and you don't know what to go with. Now, while we're on that subject, another really good tip, if you will, is to use the recommended builds. Now, I would only use recommended builds on normal or below, and if you're new, I wouldn't recommend playing above normal anyway. Not until you've got some experience and you understand how things work would I even consider moving the difficulty up. But recommended builds truly aren't that great overall. You won't find a lot of people playing on harder difficulties using these in any capacity, really. However, they are decent and they can give you a good idea of how things work if you're paying attention. If you use a recommended build and you're new, if you plan on playing the game more than once, what I would actually recommend here is pay attention to the decisions that the recommended builds are making and try to understand why it's making them. Even if they aren't ideal, but that's a really good place to start of learn and grow if you don't want to just straight up look up build guides. Because, while we're also on the subject, Wrath of the Righteous has an amazing build community. I've made plenty myself. There are tons and tons out there, builds that are all over the place, suited for all sorts of difficulties. But for now, we're just talking the basics. Now, before we move on from this page, I want to bring your attention to the details section in the bottom right here. This is going to bring up a separate page that gives us a whole lot of information that, if you don't know what you're looking at, means nothing. So for starters, the top right corner up here, we see this little 6-box diagram, if you will. The top row is the general indication of that class's saving throws. Every character gets Fortitude, Will, and Reflex saving throws. These are used in various instances, usually to protect against magic or poison or just various types of effects. A lot of times you'll get a saving throw against them that either negates them or causes it to deal half damage, something like that. Each class actually gains bonuses to these saving throws in different amounts. So for instance, we see here the Kineticist will have a high Fortitude save and a high Reflex save. The bottom is probably more interesting information for most people, as it will tell you your base attack bonus, your HP per level, as well as your starting HP. Starting HP and HP per level are important, but probably not as important as you would think, especially once you start understanding mechanics, but definitely something good to know. Honestly, the most important thing here, in my opinion, is base attack bonus. If you're not familiar with the Pathfinder system, this is one of the crucial things you need to know. As you might imagine, this is the base bonus to your attack. It goes up as you level by a set amount. Now, technically, it's something like full, 3/4, or half. So for average, I believe it's 3/4. Low is, I believe, half, and high is full, meaning that, of course, they get their full bonus. Now, this is actually where multi-attack comes from as well. As your base attack bonus reaches 6, 11, or 16, and then, so on and so forth, this is where you get extra attacks. Every time you hit one of those milestones, you get another attack. However, the consecutive attack will actually come with a -5 penalty that accumulates, which actually we can see the example on screen here. But basically you lose -5 to the base attack bonus with each consecutive attack. All very important information right there that will tell you a lot about a class just at a glance. And then we have our class skills down in the bottom. We'll talk a bit more about this when we get to skills. Now, next up, let's talk race. So, obviously, we have a ton of different fantasy races here to choose from, or ancestries as they're known in Pathfinder 2e, but in 1e, they are races. These do more or less what you would expect. A lot of them give bonuses or minuses to various ability scores, which are your base stats, and then usually a few extra things on top of that, which are typically just like little racial traits that can be helpful. But truth be told, a lot of those are actually hard to beat the human's extra feat selection. So whereas a lot of other classes get extra traits and extra ability scores, humans get an extra feat, which is a big deal. Pathfinder 1e uses what a lot of people like to call the feat tax, which means that in order to facilitate your build, oftentimes there are a lot of feats that have to be taken, and humans can be huge in offsetting that because they get an extra feat at character creation. whereas a lot of the other characters usually just get stuff that is more like ability scores. However, due to things like items, the ability score bonuses kind of fall off towards the late game where it doesn't really matter. Whereas having an extra feat is just never not a good thing 95% of the time. There are some classes who get so many feats it just genuinely doesn't matter, but there are in most cases, no better option than human, kind of surprisingly. However, a lot of the other races are just cool and still have some interesting things going on. Several of them can pick heritage options. This will allow you to sort of customize an ability they'll get, as well as some of the specific attribute bonuses they're getting, or ability score bonuses, which is pretty cool. But from here, we pick our background. So a few things to understand about backgrounds. Believe it or not, while they can be pretty cool, more often than not, the bonuses are actually pretty mild. There are a few that are actually really, really good. For instance, if you pick the Acolyte background, this will actually change your persuasion checks to use your wisdom instead of charisma bonus, which can be honestly a pretty big game changer for a class that has high wisdom or requires high wisdom. Potentially the most useful thing that you can use backgrounds for is to pick up extra proficiencies or class skills you don't already have. For instance, if you have a class that doesn't have a certain weapon proficiency that you want to use, you can use a background to pick up that weapon proficiency, which is just a way to get it without spending a feat. However, under the regional, we do actually have a subset of various backgrounds that do slightly more specific stuff, though again, relatively minor. But generally speaking, the regional tab actually has the more unique stuff, whereas everything else tends to generally just be weapon proficiencies or various little class skills or small bonuses to like your saving throws, that type of stuff. Now, something I want to talk about with the proficiencies real quick is that if you read the whole background text here, if your class already has the proficiency granted by the background, what you get instead is a bonus. So if you have the class skill, you'll get a competence bonus to that skill. Whereas if it's a weapon proficiency, you'll get an enhancement bonus. Or if it's armor, you'll get a -1 armor check penalty. The skill bonus and the armor proficiency bonus that you get from doubling up on the proficiency that your class already has can be pretty useful. But even then, kind of in a minor way. Now, with the weapons, you get an enhancement bonus, but this is important to understand that in Pathfinder, bonuses do not stack. So when you get that enhancement bonus, an enhancement bonus is the same type of bonus that magical weapons will have, like +1, +2. That's considered an enhancement bonus, which means it does not stack with the extra bonus you get here from these background double ups, if you will. So while that can be pretty helpful in the early act, all of this kind of becomes not as useful as it might initially sound. So in many cases, a background can be better than nothing, but I wouldn't freak out about this choice really, and you can just choose none, even if that's a little boring. Alright, and that brings us to ability scores. Now this is going to vary wildly depending on what class you pick, but generally speaking, you'll see your racial bonuses here to the side. In some instances, you can actually change which stat this applies to, or in the case of things like picking a heritage, it will also show up here. And then we see our modifier over here, as well as our actual ability score. Now, we have a sort of point-buy system here where we have 25 points to spend in our ability scores, which are Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. Now, depending on what class you have, the stats with the green thumbs will tell you what is important to that class for one reason or another. Now, generally speaking, Strength is responsible for all of your melee attack rolls as well as damage rolls and, things like athletics checks, etc. Dex is responsible for your ranged attack rolls. However, something to keep in mind, and something that's not readily apparent, is that a lot of spells in this game, in this particular system of 1E, actually use what are called ranged touch attacks, which fall under dexterity. So that's why you'll actually see a lot of caster classes with dexterity, because they need it to actually land hits sometimes. Constitution is, of course, your base health and is somewhat important for a lot of characters. And then there are the mental stats, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. These are often used as casting stats, and if you're playing a casting class, they are very important, as if you don't have enough of your casting stat as a casting class, you just won't be able to cast spells. And they also affect a variety of skills as well as things like your saving throws. Now, another thing to understand over here is the modifier column. As you put points into each individual ability score, every 2 points gives you a +1 to the modifier. And of course, if you go below 10, it gives you a minus, which means a penalty to that roll. Now, oftentimes abilities or just your attack rolls in general will use this modifier, not your raw ability score, which I would say most people are familiar with in this day and age, as that's a pretty common thing, but still, just wanted to point it out just in case. And last but not least, if you are fighting an enemy that does damage or drains an ability score and it reaches 0, you die. That is true for every single ability score. If any of these reach 0 via monsters draining them or dealing ability damage, there's a difference between drain and damage, by the way. But if it reaches 0, you're dead. Literally any of the 6. Now, that brings us to skills. This varies a lot, kind of depending on what you've got going on. Your class, your intelligence, a lot of stuff actually. Similar to what is going on with the ability scores, we get this modifier based on our ability scores themselves, actually, and then our rank in that particular skill. Now, if it's a class skill, the first point we put into it will give us an extra +4. So it will jump up quite a bit. So we can see what we have as class skills by this little green V mark here, which will tell us right off the bat. Now, each one of these comes up in various ways throughout the game, and for the most part, you want to have a good spread across all your characters and your companions to do various things. Trickery is pretty important. It's the one that you're going to be using to do things like disarm traps and just various devices, as well as pick locks. It comes up a lot. It's very important. You should always have somebody who specializes in trickery on your team. They give you one right out of the gate, so it's pretty easy to do. Another one is perception. Perception is king. There are so many things you'll miss in this game if you do not have someone with a high perception score. Very, very important that that is the case. Persuasion, for obvious reasons, sometimes you'll be able to talk your way around various difficult things, which is made infinitely easier if you have someone with persuasion. All of the knowledge and lore checks can help you with a variety of things, like just learning about stuff, interacting with things in the environment, and knowing what they are. Athletics will help you, of course, with more physical things, climbing, that type of stuff. Mobility is similar in that sense, but usually doesn't involve strength, but rather just movement. Stealth comes up. You can actually stealth in combat, but is, truth be told, probably the least used of everything on this list. And then we have use magic device. This is going to affect your ability to activate wands and scrolls you would normally be unable to use. If you're wanting to use a lot of the scrolls you find laying around, this can be useful, but if you're playing a casting class, this doesn't really come up a lot, but important to know what it does, I would say. Now, from there, we pick a bunch of class-specific stuff. Everything I've talked about up to this point is pretty general. You'll also pick at least 1 feat for each character at the level 1. Every odd level, you'll get a basic feat. And like everything else, they kind of give you some general recommendations over here, but this is the part where if you're new, I would recommend a guide because as you can see, there are just an enormous amount of feats. And if you're new, this is just an overwhelming amount of information and you won't know exactly what to do with it right away. And this is where just knowledge is going to help you more than anything and just kind of learning the system, which in my opinion is best done by playing the game. Though the game will give you some base recommendations, but I would tell you those can be a little shoddy. For instance, just to give a bit of a tip here, casters actually benefit from things like point blank shot and precise shot because they are using ranged touch attacks, which are actually affected by these feats, which can be a little weird, but it's just kind of the way 1E tended to work here. But the last thing I want to mention on character creation in a lot of detail is deity. Now, deity, for the most part, if you are not playing a class where the deity is important, is mostly just a flavor decision. However, some classes actually do have more going on with the deity they choose. For instance, it will give them access to a variety of domains depending on their class and how their abilities work. But something that does affect every character in this regard is that throughout the game, there is a bunch of interactions sprinkled about for each individual deity represented here, meaning that every once in a while, if you choose to worship, say, Callistra, you might run into a situation where you can invoke that deity and then get a buff for the encounter, which is a really cool bit of flavor, actually. Now, this doesn't come up a ton, but it is cool, so I wanted to mention it in case you thought this was just a meaningless decision across the board. But for the most part, just kind of a cool one, and in some cases, this will restrict your alignment. For instance, if you want to worship Asmodeus, you're gonna have to be evil, or at the very least, lawful neutral. Now, that brings us to alignment. Now, depending on your deity, for instance, this is going to be a bit reined in on what you can choose. As you can see here, I've only got 4 options. This is because my deity is Callistra. Alignment in this game is actually really important, but it's important for the mythic paths, which we're about to get into. Mythic paths are incredibly dependent on your alignment, which we'll talk about in more depth here in just a minute. But understand that while you can make and shape a ton of decisions across Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, a lot of which can be influenced by your alignment decisions, like choosing to be evil or choosing to be good, that type of stuff. This comes into play the most when it comes to your mythic path, which, as it just so happens, is the next thing we're about to jump into. Starting with an overview of the system and then moving into how to unlock each mythic path, as well as the transformation and why that's important.
So first of all, what is the mythic path system? Well, basically, this is a separate progression system in addition to your character level that allows you to basically ascend into some higher being. Now, this will wind up giving you all sorts of powers and things depending on which path you choose. However, regardless of any of those things, this uses a milestone system, which means as you reach certain points in the game, you will be granted mythic ranks. So there's no experience or anything to grind out. It's literally just once you reach certain points in the game, you get another rank. Now, the first 2 ranks of the game, you will be what's called a mythic hero, meaning you haven't actually picked a path yet, you've just absorbed a lot of power. The mythic hero will have their pick of 6 choices of where this power is coming from, basically. And this will give you a variety of abilities. They are all kind of thematically based around the 6 base mythic path choices, which we'll get into here in just a second. But I do want to mention, these are non-binding, so even if you pick the one that revolves around death, you do not have to pick the associated mythic path that's actually geared towards later. You can, for instance, pick the death one and then still choose the angel mythic path. Now, I also want to mention that when you gain your first rank, as well as every other odd level, you will get a mythic ability. These are very strong abilities. Now, the ones that are based off your rank like this are available for everyone, just depending on what class and feats, that type of stuff you have. But these are just very strong abilities that usually augment something you already do, for instance, like adding more damage to it, making you do more attacks of opportunity, that type of stuff. And then every even level, you'll get a mythic feat. Mythic feats are just improvements of regular feats, usually. So, for instance, if you have the dodge feat, which grants you 1 extra AC as a dodge bonus, the dodge mythic feat will double that and make it 2 AC. And you'll basically see just a ton of that stuff. The mythic version of a feat will take the base feat just a little bit farther, and usually has the base feat as a prerequisite. That said, there are feats that don't require a prerequisite or anything. There are just several that do. Now, that brings us to rank 3. Once you hit rank 3, you should have the option to choose between 6 mythic paths, provided you've encountered them. So in order to unlock mythic paths throughout the story, you have to actually encounter them as choices, or your character won't know that they are a choice. For these base 6, I have a video on each and every single one of them if you're curious, but they are as follows. They are Angel and Demon, which are the defaults. You'll get those regardless. There is Aeon, which you will encounter directly as a result of the main story. There is Trickster, which is found in Act 1. There is Azada, which is found in Act 1, as well as Lich, which requires the most work, which is primarily in Act 2, because your 3rd mythic rank comes at the end of Act 2. From here, you'll get to choose, again, your actual mythic path and unlock it. And depending on which one you choose, your powers will vary greatly. Your appearance can even change a little bit. And then from here, you'll start gaining ranks as you continue to progress the story and become more like this thing that you are becoming, such as a demon or an angel, etc. Now, this is pretty much what we knew during the beta. However, we were aware that there were other late-game mythic paths. So this is where I'm going to discuss those. And I'm also going to mention all of them by name, which I only point out because I'm just trying to give people warning if they, for instance, want to figure out what is what when. At Mythic rank 8, at that point in the story, be given an option to either change or continue down the Mythic path you are already on. Your choices here are to continue on the same path from those first 6, or move into one of the late game Mythic paths that you would have discovered past the original choice at rank 3. These Mythic paths are the Gold Dragon, the Swarm That Walks, the Legend, and the Devil. Now, I want to point out the Legend specifically right here because this option is also unmissable. At rank 8, you can pick Swarm That Walks, Gold Dragon, or Devil if you've found them, whereas Legend is the default option here. So if you haven't found Swarm, Gold Dragon, or Devil, at rank 8 you will still be given the choice of continuing down the path you are on right now, or switching to Legend. There you go, guys. There is the broad system. First off, how do you unlock the Aeon as an option for a Mythic path? It's impossible to miss the start of it. However, it is possible to miss it. So the start of it, you actually have to engage with it to progress the story in the first act. You'll find an item, and Aeon contacts you, or at least what's left of an Aeon. So just real quick, Aeons in Pathfinder are beings of pure law and order. Outsiders and alien to the universe in a lot of ways, but suffice to say they're basically like the embodiment of law. So you'll encounter what's left of one in an item. You can actually choose to reject the Aeon right there, which obviously for this you can't do. You need to accept it. However, later on in Act 1, spoiler free here, specifically at the end of Act 1, you're required to deal with a situation. That situation will have an option to use the Aeon Mythic path. You have to use that option at that moment to continue on this path. If you don't, the Aeon is no longer an option, even if you decided to take it with you earlier. The Azada Mythic path is a little more difficult to track down than the rest of the 6 that are currently in the game. So just to give a brief rundown, eventually you're going to go to a place called Market Square where you're going to find some priests that are arguing with each other. One of them is going to run away. You're going to get a quest to go track that guy down. You need to find him, you need to not kill him, and afterwards, a group of 3 acolytes, shall we say, will come approach you and give you another side quest that you then need to resolve and be nice to them, which will unlock the Azada Mythic path. Very easy to miss. This Mythic path is missable, but they do kind of put it right in your face. So early on, you'll be required to confront some bandits, let's say. The option for the Trickster Mythic path will show up. This conversation has to happen. It's part of the story in Act 1. What you might be thinking is that you'll resolve this situation some other way, and maybe there will be other Trickster options in the future, because this happens pretty early on. However, this is the only Trickster Mythic path option that will come up before you actually choose your Mythic path at rank 3. So if you don't choose this right here, you're gonna miss it. Early game conversation, when a Trickster Mythic path conversation shows up, click it, it's your only shot. It does have a pretty amusing ending. In order to unlock the Lich Mythic path, all you need to do is in a place called Leper's Smile, which you will go to as part of the main story, you will find a wand. Don't destroy it. Later on, you will find yourself in a place called the Lost Chapel. At some point, you will get access to the basement. You need to bring the wand to the basement of the Lost Chapel. And once you have done that and have a conversation with someone, you will then unlock the Lich Mythic path at the appropriate time when it comes time to unlock your Mythic path and actually make a distinction, which happens at rank 3 of your Mythic ranks. Let's talk about how to actually unlock the Gold Dragon. So in the very first dungeon where the game starts, which is Caves Beneath Canabras, right when you start out, you'll find 2 scales of Turindalev. They're very shiny, they're incredibly hard to miss, there's 2 of them. You technically only need 1. They also function as a early game revive spell with a drawback. However, do not use them to revive them, you need them. Well, you need at least 1. Save that scale. Once you meet a man named the Storyteller, who is part of the main plot, you will then be able to give him the scale of Turindalev, and he'll tell you more about Turindalev, which is a silver dragon. He will go on to explain that he can tell you more if you find more items that used to belong to this dragon. However, we can't do anything else until we reach Act 2, specifically a place called Leper's Smile. In Leper's Smile, there is a cave. In that cave, you will find Turindalev's second object, a claw that used to belong to her. Now, you can't go straight to the Storyteller with this claw, because you don't meet him again until Act 3. In Act 3, as again part of the main story, you will encounter the storyteller. At this point, you are able to give him the claw, and this will reveal the location of Tarindalev's lair. You need to go to that lair. You will meet a man named Hal after you fight some cultists. You need to do what Hal says, because Hal, as he reveals in this conversation, is a gold dragon. Attacking him, or basically displeasing him in any way, will lock you out of this mythic path. So even if it's not like your thing or what you're role-playing your character as, if you want the gold dragon, go along with what Hal says, which is to spare the cultist. Now, that's all you can do. This will not come up again until right before you make your late-game mythic path choice. You will run into Hal again. He's not here, then obviously you did something wrong and probably didn't spare the cultist. Right before you get to your mythic rank 8 choice, you will meet Hal again. You'll be given the option to attack him. Don't, obviously, continue to just be nice to him. And then when you get to your mythic rank 8 choice, you'll have the option of Gold Dragon. So in order to become a devil, you have to initially choose either the Aeon or the Azada mythic path, because those are the only two paths that will come in contact with a character necessary to make you a devil later. Now, personally, I use the Aeon for this. However, I imagine the Azada is fairly similar in that when you meet this particular character, which is a demon named Melez, or something like that, basically you just need to do what he wants you to do. However, I would actually recommend doing Aeon for this mythic path because devils are lawful evil if you're unaware, and Aeons require you to be lawful, whereas Azada requires you to be chaotic good. Just from that standpoint alone, Aeon kind of bleeds into this more naturally, in my opinion, and is a little more transparent about what's about to happen. So with that out of the way, basically choose your Aeon mythic path. Eventually, a devil named Melez will come to your court, and him being a lawful creature, you as an Aeon should allow him to take up residence, shall you say, as an advisor. So for starters, you have to let him do that. Not letting him do that obviously won't work for you, provided you want the devil mythic path. Second, the Aeon will be given advice by this person about how to handle certain cases. You need to take his advice every time. Now initially, this won't do anything, and the game will progress. Don't think too much about it. As long as you took his advice and completed the mythic path quest for your Aeon thing and took the devil's advice, you'll be okay. And eventually, when you get to Mythic Rank 8, you'll be given a choice to either confirm or change your Mythic Path to a late-game Mythic Path. It is important that you confirm your Aeon Mythic Path, and I would assume also your Azada one here. Though again, it might be slightly different for the Azada. But for Aeon, you definitely have to confirm your Aeon Mythic Path choice at Rank 8. So continue to be an Aeon, and eventually, this demon will actually come back to your court, so to speak, as an advisor. And he'll basically tell you, hey, you were so cooperative with the things I wanted you to do beforehand, we would like to extend an offer to you to become a devil. So obviously you have to agree to this. Telling him no is not going to work out for you. And he'll basically say that in order to do this, they have to give you a sort of trial near a place called Canopus, which is where you started the game. So you'll go down there to a place called Bastion of Justice, and you'll actually be hit with a random event right before you get there. And the devils will actually give you a trial at this crossroads, which is where the place actually is. And here, they will give you an actual trial. Now, if you fail this, you'll just straight up be killed. But that said, it's not too difficult, especially if you can pass the diplomacy checks that will come up through it, where basically the devil will kind of run you through the things you've done throughout the game, and you'll have a chance to defend yourself, which is the diplomacy checks and things. And in the end, as long as you pass the trial, they will extend to you the option to become a devil. You select it, and then you get to choose the Devil Mythic Path right there, which is again different from every other late game Mythic Path. Swarm That Walks is easily the most difficult path to unlock, and it requires you to make certain choices that won't even seem to have anything to do with the path itself, and thus I have to explain. The second warning is that choosing Swarm That Walks will make your entire party leave you. Every single companion will leave you if you become the Swarm That Walks. Every single one of them. This is offset by the Swarm That Walks Mythic Path mechanics, of course, and I can actually see that in the initial offering of those mechanics, so I know it's addressed, of course, but just keep in mind, all of your companions will leave. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into this. Now, the first choice you need to make to get this Mythic Path to work is not something you would initially realize is even related. And that is, in Act 2, when your army begins its march, you have the option of persuading Queen Galfrey to come with you. In order to unlock the swarm, she cannot come with you because she prevents you from doing something I'm about to explain, and not doing it will lock you out of the path. Thus, bringing Queen Galfrey with you in Act 2 is a no-go for this Mythic Path. Now, what is that? In Act 2, in a place called Leper's Smile, you will be accosted by demon bugs called Vescivores at a place called Leper's Smile. You'll resolve this situation by killing their queen. And these Vescivores work off of a pheromone system, so to speak. And that's how they're attracted to things. And this is a revelation you'll have while you're talking after defeating the queen. In order to continue on this path, you need to have your military, fill a bucket basically of these pheromones and take it with you for the march on Dresden. When you get to Dresden, you need to use the Vescivore pheromones to have Vescivores swarm the city as part of your siege. This is an incredibly evil thing to do. You'll get a lot of soldiers killed. Queen Galfrey will outright prevent you from doing this if she is with you. She will not let you do it. It is not an option if she is with you. Thus, she cannot come with you, because this is mandatory. After the siege, you'll be given a small side quest to track down what happened to the Vescivores. In a house on the south side of Dresden, you'll be able to find what's left of their swarm. You'll find a few Vescivore swarms that you'll need to kill, as well as a fledgling Vescivore queen. Do not kill this queen. If you kill it, thus ridding Dresden of the Vescivores, you've locked yourself out of the path already. So let the queen live. After you clear out the house, the side quest itself will complete upon you finding the queen. You do not have to kill it for any reason, and you should absolutely not if you want to unlock this mythic path. Now, that's only the first half, because there's an entirely separate thing we need to do, and that is meet an actual swarm that walks. This takes the form of a boss that is mandatory. He is part of the main story. He is unmissable. His name is Xanthir the Plagued One, or Xanthir Vang. Xanthir is a swarm that walks. You'll have an option after fighting him to talk to him, and you can ask him about how he became what he is. He'll basically tell you that if you want to be what he is, you're going to have to put in the work like he did. Now, lucky for you, he says he has notes around here somewhere that you might be able to read, but beyond that, he's not going to help you. And you're forced to kill him no matter what happens here. At this point, that conversation by itself is not enough. You then have to loot his journal or his apprentice's journal, which are in the room with him. You need to read those journals. After doing so, you'll see a little pop-up above your head that says, you've learned something from this book. This actually gives you a crusade management task called Xanthir's Experiments, where basically you will recreate his experiments. Again, very harsh thing, evil thing to do. People will not like you for this. After doing this, actually, after completing that task, Anivia, which is one of your advisors, will come up and basically warn you that doing this will cause everyone to leave you, which is true. But it's just a little foreshadowing. Now, that is what you have to do so far. That is all you can do before Act 4, which is where the game progresses. After this, there's nothing else you can do. To recap, brought the Vescivores to Dresden, used them, did not kill their queen, learned about Xanthir's research, as well as completed the research task. You have to do all of those before Act 4. Now, once you progress the game, you're going to find yourself back in Dresden at the beginning of Act 5. Immediately upon entering Dresden, you'll be given this dialogue, if you let the queen live. And basically, you'll be given an errand to hunt down the now fully grown-up queen that is still in Dresden. It's in the same house, you just have to go fight it. Now, if you fight it and you did not do Xanthir's research, you won't know what to do with the queen. However, if you did Xanthir's research, the correct answer, as the dialogue will tell you, is to eat the queen, which is super gross. And as long as you've eaten the queen, you're good to go. At this point, you can proceed with the rest of the story, and then at Mythic rank 8, you will be given the option to become the swarm that walks. Mythic rank 8 is where you sort of lock in your mythic path choice. And at this point, you'll be given a mythic quest to carry on your mythic path, so to speak. Now, it is important that you actually complete these quests. You'll be given mythic path quests just as you play the game, definitely before this point as well. However, I want to stress it's important that you actually complete them, because mythic quests can actually fail. A lot of them are tied to a chapter that you are in at the time. Thus, if you move on from that chapter, those quests will fail. And failing some of the earlier Mythic Path quests can kind of mess up your later game stuff. To put it simply, not doing your Mythic Path quests and or failing them will eventually lead to you just not being able to get your final transformation, because it is a missable thing. But as long as you are doing your quests and trying your best to actually lean into the Mythic Path you chose, you should be okay.
All right, now that we've got all of that Mythic Path stuff out of the way, we're going to shift into talking about combat. First, I'm going to cover the basics, then we're going to go over spellcasting specifically, and then we're going to talk about Metamagic, which kind of deserves its own little section as it's a little complicated how it actually works in the menus, so to speak. But as we move into the combat section, I do want to mention a few random things right here at the start. For starters, you have available to you what's called a 5-foot step in turn-based mode, mostly is when you'll see this, that you can use to disengage from enemies. This will help you avoid attacks of opportunity, which I will be talking about more in depth. There's also the ability to activate stealth, primarily outside of combat, and then you can use it to sneak up on enemies or give yourself an advantage in that opening attack. And you do this by pressing the small eye icon right next to your companion bar down at the bottom. Now, beyond those couple of things, I did want to reiterate that we are not covering absolutely everything there is to know here, but more going over the basics to try to ease people into the game here. For instance, I'm not going to be covering mounted combat a whole bunch here just because it's a little more complicated. There's more rules involved, and my goal is not to overwhelm people, but rather get you accustomed to the basics, and from there you can start formulating your own questions about what else you would like to know. So yes, to reiterate, this is not everything, but I think it covers the bare bones basics that everyone needs to know. Now, most of this should apply to Kingmaker as well, but I am making this specifically for Wrath of the Righteous, so take that for what you will. Moreover, if you're a veteran, I don't know what you're expecting to get out of this video. Thank you for watching, but also, again, this is about the super basics of combat, just like how attack rolls work, that kind of stuff. With that out of the way, let's dive into this. So first things first, I want to start with ability scores. Ability scores are from 0 to 20 at a base, and then there are modifiers that can affect that. Now, typically speaking, you're never going to see an ability score all the way down to 0, outside of like being undead or something, which for instance, you just wouldn't have a constitution modifier at all. And even then, it's not even technically 0, you just don't have one. But for every 2 points, an ability score is over 10, with 10 being like average of an ability score. Every 2 something is over that, so say 12, you'll start getting +1 for each 2 that it's over 10 to modifiers. So 12 would be +1, 14 would be +2, 16 is +3, etc. Now, we'll get into what those modifiers are for here in just a minute, but we're going to start with talking about strength. Points in strength and the modifier from it affects melee attack rolls, damage rolls on melee and thrown weapons, and while it doesn't affect the attack roll for ranged, it will incur a penalty if you don't have enough strength. So just to give a quick example, if I'm firing a bow with 12 strength, I won't get the +1 damage to that from my strength. However, I will get a penalty if I said had 8 and therefore had a -1 modifier. I would actually take that penalty to my range damage roll, but I don't get the bonus for the rolls on ranged weapons, outside of thrown weapons. In addition, strength also affects things like athletics checks as well as just base strength checks. Then we have dexterity. Dexterity affects our ranged attack rolls, including for some spells. It can give a bonus to our armor class when we're not flat-footed. Again, I'll get into what flat-footed here is in a bit. It also affects our reflex defense. I'll cover that in a bit. Our mobility, trickery, and stealth checks as well, which are all skills. Now, Constitution is basically where we get our health die from. So this modifier affects how much health we get. It also affects our fortitude defense. And then we have Intelligence. Intelligence affects how many skill points we get each level for, putting into actual skills. It also affects our knowledge checks, which are part of the skills. Essentially, there's a couple different types of knowledge, and your character will roll an intelligence modifier for those checks, as well as granting certain class spells, such as for a wizard. Then we have Wisdom. Wisdom will affect our will checks, which is a defense type, our perception, as well as lore skill checks, as well as, again, some class spells. Now, Charisma affects our ability to use magic devices, channeling energy for certain classes, some class spells, such as a paladin or a bard, as well as being able to persuade people, as charisma is actually for. Now, so that is a breakdown of what each ability score will actually do. But what I'm talking about specifically with those is that's what the modifier affects. So again, for each 2 points we have above 10, we're going to get plus to something, or for every 2 levels below 10 we have, we're going to get minus something. That modifier is going to affect those skill rolls I just mentioned for each stat. So for instance, if I have 8 strength and I'm trying to, say, move a boulder or something else that would incur a strength check, I'm going to take a -1 to rolling on that check. Now, you also heard me reference skill checks as well as certain types of defensive checks there. The defensive checks I will get into a bit later in a separate portion of the video. However, the skill checks are pretty easy to explain. There's a variety of skills you get to put points in, such as persuasion, athletics, trickery, stealth. Trickery is like picking locks, by the way, and all sorts of things like that. And when you make a character, you'll get to put points dependent on your class and intelligence into those skills. The initial point put into a skill gives you a +4 to it, and then every subsequent point increases that by +1. That modifier from your skills gets applied in addition to your ability scores to your skill checks. So for instance, my mobility is a combination of my dexterity modifier as well as my mobility skills, as well as any other modifiers that might affect my mobility, such as wearing armor. Now, let's move on to attacking an enemy. So when it comes to attacking an enemy, first things first, we need to start with initiative. Now, in the games here, initiative isn't a huge deal, but it is still a thing. Now, for real time with pause, initiative is quite simply how fast you get to act at the start of combat. In turn-based, initiative is more like, who's going when kind of thing, basically whose turn it is. Whereas in real time with pause, it's just how quickly you get to fight at the start of combat. But outside of that, let's start talking about our attack bonuses. So attack bonuses basically come in two types, melee and spellcasting. For melee, we're talking about our base attack bonus. This is going to increase basically as you level up, and once this bonus reaches 6, 11, and 16, for each of those respectively, we get an extra attack per round. So how attack rolls wind up being rolled, and specifically what an attack roll is, by the way, is rolling to see if you hit something. It is separate from a damage roll. So first you got to roll to see if you hit, which is your attack roll, which is what your base attack bonus is going to be applied to. So for a melee attack, rolling to hit something is your base attack bonus, plus your strength, plus any other modifiers, versus the difficulty check. In the case of trying to hit something, the difficulty check is just your enemy's armor class for a regular melee attack. And we'll get into armor class in the defensive portion of this video. Suffice to say, that is how attack rolls for the most part are calculated. Now for a ranged attack, instead of using your strength modifier, you would use, of course, your dex modifier. And then we have criticals. So criticals in this game are rolled for into a threat range and then confirmed by a separate roll. So basically, if you roll to hit something, and you roll within your threat range, which is usually just 20, but some weapons will have a threat range of like 19 to 20. So if you roll in that threat range on an attack roll, you will potentially be able to critically hit. However, you have to roll a second attack roll that then just has to clear the enemy's AC to become a critical hit. Now, it's worth mentioning, if you roll a natural 20, it is always a hit. It might not necessarily be a critical if you miss your confirmation roll, but it will still hit and you'll roll regular damage. Now the opposite is true of a natural 1. So if you roll a natural 1, you'll just miss guaranteed, whereas a natural 20 will always hit. Now critical damage is, typically speaking, just a multiplied version of your weapon damage. Typically speaking, damage from other sources, such as precision damage, is not calculated into this. Now there's a lot of variance on that, but just know in general, criticals are multiplied by your weapon damage. And now we're going to move on to defense. So it's important to note in Pathfinder, especially when you're talking about defense, because that bonuses do not stack of the same type typically. So for instance, if I'm wearing armor and I also have bracers of armor on, the bonuses from both of those things won't stack. I just get the bigger of the two. So before we even talk about defense, it's important to understand that you need to diversify your bonuses. However, luckily, Wrath of the Righteous will actually tell you if you are stacking bonuses that don't stack. So if you make the mistake of doing something like that, it will actually tell you that you're only getting the bigger bonus, and you can see that in the UI, as well as probably notice it in the armor class calculation if you mouse over it. Now let's talk about what armor class actually is. Armor class is essentially the difficulty check to hit you or an enemy with a spell or armor. We'll get into the various types of armor classes right now. So there's regular armor class, which is just standard rolls, really. Then there's your flat-footed armor class. Flat-footed basically just means that you are in a situation where you cannot get your dexterity bonus to your armor class. And then, finally, we have our touch AC. Some spells and things like that don't require more than just touching someone. So touch attacks will just bypass your armor. So instead of including the armor in the difficulty roll of your touch AC, you just removed. So you don't get your armor bonus to the AC for attacks made against a touch attack. So to recap real quick, if you're being attacked by a touch attack, you don't get your armor bonus. If you are flat-footed, you don't get your dexterity bonus. That's the different types of AC, essentially. Now, touch attacks are pretty straightforward. Something's just physically touching you, and it doesn't require to bypass your armor in any way, such as certain spells. Then flat-footed has a few more caveats. So you can be caught flat-footed when your enemy is invisible, potentially, provided you don't have perks or abilities that mitigate that. You can also be caught flat-footed when you are flanked by enemies, and a few other instances. Now, that's important to know because if you are caught flat-footed, that typically opens you up to sneak attack damage if the enemy is capable of dealing it to you. Now that we have some of that out of the way, let's talk about how this is calculated. Your armor class is typically just a base of 10 plus your dexterity bonus, plus your armor bonus, plus any other modifiers. Modifiers are typically the stuff you're going to get from like accessories and stuff. So there's the armor you're wearing, of course, and then there's modifiers from like bracers and stuff that might give you a luck bonus to AC or a dodge bonus to AC instead of a regular bonus to AC. There are necklaces that will give you a natural armor bonus, which essentially just raises your base armor. So there is actually a lot going on with the armor portion of that calculation, because armor comes with a max dexterity bonus as well as an armor check penalty. Armor will cap your dexterity bonus to AC. So for instance, if I am wearing an armor that has a 3 max dexterity bonus, but I have a +5 modifier for my dexterity, what that +3 max dex means is that I can only get +3 to my AC from my dexterity while wearing this armor. Now, that may or may not matter in terms of giving me more AC. So in some cases, the actual armor from the armor is going to be so high that losing a couple points from my dex modifier to my AC is okay. And then armor also has what's called an armor check penalty. Now, this doesn't directly relate to your AC, but it's worth talking about right here. Armor check penalty is basically the minus to a skill check you get because you're wearing armor. So for instance, if you're trying to, be stealthy, but you're wearing heavy armor, that's going to come with a heavy armor check penalty, which is basically just a negative modifier to the skill check. So moving on to various other types of defense, now I'm going to talk about saving rolls. These are the fortitude, reflex, and will defense that I spoke about earlier. So the total for these defenses is a combination of your class bonus plus your stat modifiers, as well as other modifiers such as like a cloak of resistance or something. What each of these individual defenses do is potentially reduce or avoid the effects of magic or unusual attacks. So most magical attacks or something like that will have a saving throw attached to them. And essentially, fortitude, for instance, is like your internal fortitude. So, if something tries to make you sick, you will probably have a fortitude check against that to reduce or completely mitigate the effects of that spell. And then we have reflex defense, which is basically the defense where like getting out of the way quickly enough would mitigate the damage. And then there's will, which is typically like mind altering stuff. These are your saving throws against, again, magic. So if somebody throws a fireball at you, you're probably going to get a reflex save to potentially take like half damage from it. So guys, that is the basics of how to attack, how to defend yourself, how ability scores work, how skill checks work. Now at the end of this video here, which is right now, I'm going to wrap up some other things that I think are important, but don't really fit into any of the categories I mentioned above. So just kind of stuff that's useful to know. So we have speed. This is basically how far you can move in 3 seconds. So for most people, that's going to be like 20-ish feet. Then we have attacks of opportunity. Attacks of opportunity is basically where you use an opening in defenses to make an extra attack. So for instance, if you are moving past an enemy, if you're trying to grapple someone, if you're making a ranged attack right next to an enemy, all of that's going to provoke an attack of opportunity because you're lapsing your defenses to an enemy next to you. The same is also true of your characters. You will also get to make attacks of opportunity. Now typically you only get so many per round depending on a few various modifiers. I just mentioned per round, so what does that mean? When it comes to rounds in Pathfinder, a round is 6 seconds, and you get so many actions per round. Now in real time with pause, that's happening all at once, but turn-based, it's literally just your turn. There are a variety of action types. Typically speaking, a standard action
and a move is pretty much your full round. However, you can potentially also use swift and free actions once per round as well. Now, those action types, to sum them up, a standard action is basically like attacking or using an ability typically. Then you have your move action. This is obviously like various movement, so if you're drawing your weapon or drawing your bow, that kind of thing. And then we have full round abilities. Full round abilities do exactly that. They take the entire round. You can't do anything else. And then we have free and swift actions. Free actions, there is no cost. So think of a free action like knocking an arrow while you fired your bow. That would technically be a free action because it's so small, for instance, it's not even calculated. However, there are a variety of free actions, essentially, that you can use in combat. And then there are swift actions. These are where you're doing something, but it's essentially an instantaneous thing. So there are a lot of buffs in combat that are swift actions that you can use each round. For instance, at level 10, an assassin gets to use their poisons as a swift action, which basically means they can apply poison instantly and then use it in the same round. And then lastly, how does dying and death work? So dying is essentially when you hit 0 health points. This will put you down on the ground. You'll be unconscious. However, you won't die until your negative health is more than your constitution. So for instance, if I have like 14 constitution and I reach negative 14 health, that character is dead. Actually, one last thing before I forget about it. Then there is the concept of concealment. So concealment is basically a 20 or 50%, depending on if it's partial or full concealment, to just straight up miss a successful attack roll. So if I'm attacking something that is in concealment and I successfully hit it with my attack roll, there is a 20 to 50% chance I will then just miss it because of concealment. Now in the damage, this is like literally marked as concealment, so you'll know that you hit the target, but because of the concealment chance you missed. This applies to things like stealth and invisibility. There you go, guys. There is a roundup of a lot of the basic mechanics of how to attack and defend yourself in Pathfinder. So late game and more in-depth play of this game is essentially just extrapolating on these basic effects and understanding how they work. So personally, I find just a base understanding of the very low systems like this, where like just, how is it calculated whether or not I'm missing something, to be incredibly helpful. A guide to spellcasting in Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous. For my regular listeners, my voice sounds a little off because I lost my voice recently as I was a bit under the weather. But nonetheless, we are going over this guide. So this guide will give you all of the basics to spellcasting in general, and basically how a lot of it works behind the scenes on a mechanical level. So with no further ado, let's jump into this. Now, there are primarily 2 types of spellcasting. However, occasionally you do get a third, which is basically untyped. But the 2 primaries are arcane or divine. Now, there are some roleplay implications to both of those things, but what they mean on a mechanical level is that arcane casters have to learn their spells, and that divine casters will get every spell available to them once they reach the appropriate level to get those spells. This means that arcane casters can actually learn how to cast spells from scribing scrolls from their inventory into their spellbook, which is something not available to divine casters. Now, I did also mention there is an untyped school of magic. This is very specific to a couple classes. For instance, alchemists, they technically get what are called spell extracts, meaning that they can cast spells. However, alchemists do that on a roleplay basis, basically where they turn their spells into potions that they can then either imbibe or later share with their party, which is technically classified as spellcasting, but again, fairly specific to the alchemist. Then we have prepared versus spontaneous spellcasting. Prepared is pretty straightforward. It actually just means that you have to prepare your spells prior to using them, meaning that it is a spell slot system. Basically, for every level of spells that you can cast, you'll have to prepare the spells that you can cast for that day out of every spell that you know. So you'll assign a spell to a spell slot, and then once this is done, you actually have to rest for them to become available. And then there is spontaneous spellcasting. Spontaneous spellcasters get a certain number of times they can cast that level of spells per day. So rather than preparing their spells into spell slots, they can simply cast every spell that they know of that level, but only a certain number of times per day, per level of spell. Next up, we have our casting ability. So this is basically the modifier that affects your particular class's spellcasting. Now, the primary thing that your casting ability is going to do for you is give you the ability to cast your spells, frankly. But ultimately, it's two things. In order to cast spells at a certain level, your class's appropriate class ability has to be 1 above 10 for every level you want to cast. So what that means is if I want to cast a level 4 spell, and I'm using, say, Wisdom as my casting stat, then I have to have 14 Wisdom in order to be able to cast a level 4 spell for that class. Now, the other thing that a high casting ability will do for you is just straight up give you more casts per day, meaning that it will give you more spell slots or casts per day for a spontaneous caster just across the board. So there is, of course, the minimum required to cast a spell at all, but then having above that limit will actually give you extra spell slots. Now, I occasionally answer this question when it comes to the Mythic Paths in Wrath of the Righteous, so I do want to mention it here. It is possible for some classes to merge their spellbook with the spellbook of the Mythic Path that they choose in-game. If you are playing one of those classes and you merge spellbooks with your Mythic Path, then the spellbook will still operate off of your class's casting stat. If you do not do that, then your Mythic spellbook will operate off your Mythic rank instead of your casting ability. Now, next up we have spell resistance. Some spells are subject to a target's spell resistance. Spell resistance is, in a way, like armor class, but for spells. Now, each individual spell will tell you whether or not it is affected by the enemy's spell resistance. It will just tell you that as part of the tooltip of the spell. So that might be something you want to check per spell depending on what you're doing. Now, overcoming a monster's spell resistance comes down to basically rolling a d20 and then adding your caster level. Now, we'll get into exactly what the caster level is here in just a minute. However, this can be further modified by certain feats like spell penetration. Spell penetration, effectively, for the specific role of overcoming spell resistance, adds levels to your caster level to make that check harder to overcome. So if you have spell penetration, it's still technically a d20 plus your caster level. However, your caster level is getting boosted for the specific instance of overcoming spell resistance, which is why spell penetration is such a popular feat. Damage spells are pretty much always affected by spell resistance unless they're an AoE, that is to say, an area of effect spell, as well as any spell that would cause the creature to transform or otherwise impede it in some way. Most of that is always affected by spell resistance. But again, refer to an individual spell and it will tell you exactly whether or not that spell is, in fact, affected by spell resistance. Now, next up, we are talking saving throws versus attack rolls. Believe it or not, some of your spells will actually use attack rolls to determine whether or not they actually hit something. Now, this is primarily any spell that gives you projectiles that then hit an enemy. That is primarily what is affected by attack rolls. Now, specifically, it is a ranged touch attack roll, meaning that it hits your target's touch AC as a ranged attack. Now, that is important for a couple reasons. Because it is technically a ranged attack, it benefits from dexterity. This is why you often see casting classes be recommended dexterity as an ability score, because it will impact their ability to hit targets with their spells. Furthermore, it hits touch AC, which is usually about half of whatever a target's actual AC is, sometimes even lower than that. But basically, touch AC is lower than a target's normal AC because a touch attack really only requires you to touch the target. It really doesn't matter if they're wearing armor or if they can block it. Just the act of touching the target is enough for the effect to take place, hence touch AC. And then we have saving throws. So this tends to apply to any area of effect damage spell, as well as a great many other spells. But a saving throw is basically broken down into two things: partial or full, meaning that when a spell would hit a target, they can, in some instances, perform a saving throw against the effects, and a successful throw might either partially negate the spell or fully negate the spell. Again, the tooltip of each individual spell will tell you this. Now, how are saving throws and attack rolls actually calculated for this? Saving throws are pretty straightforward. It is a d20 plus that target's appropriate defense versus the DC of the spell that you cast from your character. So what does that actually mean? Well, basically, their appropriate defense is either fortitude, reflex, or will. These are 3 defenses everyone has as a bonus. Basically, it is a bonus to the d20 roll on a saving throw. By hitting inspect and mousing over an enemy, you can see these bonuses on the tooltip that pops up. So basically, you would roll a d20, add the appropriate defense from the monster to get the total number versus the character that casted DC on that spell. Say a target has a will defense of 10, you would roll a d20, take whatever that roll was, add the 10, and then that number has to go up against the DC. Now the DC can change pretty drastically from character to character, but your DC as a spellcaster depends on quite a few things. Your caster level, items you might have equipped, but you can always see that spell's current DC simply by mousing over it. So if I want to hit something with Phantasmal Killer, I can see the DC of that spell when I mouse over it. And basically that means in order to make a successful saving throw against that particular spell, a monster would have to take their d20 plus their bonus and exceed the DC on the spell. And then that brings us to attack rolls. Now this is pretty straightforward actually. It's just a d20 plus any bonuses you have to your attack rolls versus the target's touch AC, because again, our spells are going to be ranged touch attacks. Now, the important thing to understand about the ranged touch attack rolls that you will be making is that they are, because they are technically ranged attack rolls, subject to a lot of feats that would affect ranged attacks. This is why you'll see casters pick up things like point blank shot as well as precise shot, which makes it easier to hit targets that are engaged in melee, even as a spellcaster. Now, next up, we're going to talk about caster level. Caster level, depending on what class you're playing, might just straight up be your character level. However, it is a bit more nuanced than that, because if you're multi-classing or something, you might want to pay attention to what your actual character's caster level is, which you can see by opening up the inventory and going to the spellbook menu. It will then show you your character's caster level. But basically, this is just the sum of all of the classes that are giving you caster levels. Now, some classes don't actually get caster levels right away, or they have a slowed progression, such as Paladins, for instance, who only get spells at level 4, similar to a Blood Rager. Now, caster level, like a lot of other things, can be affected by other sources. For instance, again, on spell penetration, we can pick up feats that will then add a bonus to our caster level for those rolls. So you'll want to watch out for wording and things like that, but it is important to know your caster level. And if you, again, go to the spellbook menu on your character screen, it will show you all of the levels that are giving you caster levels and what class they are coming from. But before we move on, it's important to know your caster level because oftentimes additional effects for spells are based on your caster level. Now, usually the tooltip of the spell itself will tell you about this. It will also tell you if there are any caps on this. Some spells obviously have a limit on the maximum damage they can do, regardless of how high your caster level actually is. So something to keep in mind on a per spell basis, but your caster level is very important and is a general indication of how powerful your spells are and your spellcasting itself is. Now for the last bit of this video, we are going to quickly go over a few things. For starters, spell failure. Also in the spellbook menu on your character, you will see your current spell failure chance. This basically means, for whatever reason, you're trying to cast a spell, there is a % chance of failure. This is primarily affected by equipped items. For instance, if you're a wizard, and for some reason have that wizard in heavy armor, you are then subject to an arcane spell failure chance. Now, this primarily affects arcane spellcasters, not so much divine. That said, a lot of classes that get spells and can also wear armor are usually not subject to spell failure chance as long as they are casting their own class's spells. So if they are multi-classed, for instance, they might not necessarily get the spell failure chance for their spells, but if you multi-class into something else and try to cast spells from that class, it might then be subject to spell failure. So if you're ever doing something kind of odd and you're not sure, or you actually see one of your spells fail, if you go to that character's spellbook menu, you can see your current spell failure chance based on all of the current factors that apply to your character, just right there. Obviously, you want this at 0, but depending on your class and things, it might be higher than that. And speaking of spell failure, let's talk about concentration. Now in Pathfinder, concentration isn't going to come up a ton, but it is a thing. Spells aren't required to be maintained by maintaining concentration or anything like that. The primary thing concentration is used for in Pathfinder is when you are initially casting the spell. Meaning that if you go to cast a spell, and say you're too close to an enemy or something and you take a attack of opportunity, or a enemy casts something like entangle and you are in an entangled space, something like that, you might be forced to roll a concentration check. And much like spell failure, failing this check actually just straight up makes you fail casting the spell, period. And that's primarily the way concentration is going to come up in Pathfinder, especially Wrath of the Righteous here. But basically it's when you go to cast a spell and say you take a bunch of damage, then you'll be forced to roll a concentration roll. It doesn't come up too much otherwise. And then last but not least, I did want to mention spell descriptors at the end of this. So spell descriptors are important. Some of them are fairly obvious. If you cast a fire spell,
it's going to be described as a fire spell. However, nonetheless, they are important because all of a spell's spell descriptors are also what you need to look for in a monster's immunities. Because, say you cast a mind-affecting spell. If you cast that on an undead, typically speaking, it won't work because undead are, under normal circumstances, immune to mind-affecting spells. However, there are classes like the Dirge Bard that get to completely ignore that. But by and large, the undead are immune to mind-affecting. But a spell descriptors, as they are mentioned in your spell, will be the exact same words that are used for the spell immunities of a monster. So if it's immune to compulsion or mind affecting, and your spell says it's one of those things, then it's likely not going to work outside of very specific circumstances. So always pay attention to your spell descriptors and try not to waste moves on using spells that are not going to be effective because the creature you're trying to hit with them is just straight up immune. One quick side note about that though. If you are using an energy type spell, which is to say it deals some sort of elemental damage, there is a mythic feat called Ascendant Element that will let you bypass all immunities and resistances a target might have with the chosen element. So if I'm casting fire spells against something that is immune to fire normally, but I have Ascendant Element fire, I am still going to do damage. So that would be an instance in which the fact that that target is immune to fire is irrelevant. Now, if you come from, say, Dungeons & Dragons and you're new to Pathfinder and you're curious how to cast a spell on a higher spell slot, that is one of the things Metamagic can do for you. However, it can also do quite a few other things. Starting right there, Metamagic is a way to augment and change your spells, typically at the cost of raising the spell level required to cast it. So first, how do we actually obtain the abilities to use Metamagic? Well, Metamagic will come to you through feats typically. There are, however, Metamagic rods that you can find throughout the game that upon toggling them, typically through your ability window, will then, as long as the rod is toggled, cast whatever that Metamagic is on the spell you cast while it is toggled as an ability. However, most of your Metamagic is going to come to you through feats. Most characters get a feat every other level, though characters like wizards and things can pick up extra feats related to spellcasting, which helps out with Metamagic and why I mentioned that specifically, though pretty much any character can pick these up through their regular feat choices. However, you would typically speaking not actually want to grab all of them by any means. Next up, what kinds of Metamagic are there and how can you actually use them? We're going to go through the list of all the Metamagic we can actually use. First up, we have Bolster. Bolster will cause your spells to deal additional area of effect damage, making them stronger. So spells will deal 2 more points of damage per die rolled to all of its targets. Additionally, all enemies in 5 foot of the spell targets are dealt 2 damage per die roll of the original spell. However, the spell won't be able to apply precision damage, which is typically like sneak attack damage. And then at the bottom here, we can see that this will increase the effective spell level of the spell by 1. So if we gave this to a level 3 spell, we would now have to use a level 4 spell slot to cast it. This video assumes you know the magic system of Pathfinder and the spell slot system. We might cover that in another video in the future, but if you're looking into Metamagic, I'm going to guess you have a basic understanding of the magic system itself in Pathfinder, and we're going to see this level increase +1 come up quite a bit. Next we have Empower. Empower will increase the power of our spells, causing them to deal more damage. So all of the variable numeric effects on an empowered spell are increased by half, including bonuses to those rolls. However, the saving throws and the opposed rolls that block the spell from hitting or taking effect are not affected by this. This will cause the level of the spell to increase by 2. Then we have Extend. Extend makes your spells last twice as long. However, it won't affect spells that have a duration of concentration, instantaneous, or permanent, as they obviously don't have anything to extend, or in the case of concentration, require your concentration. But typically you'd use this on things like buffs to make them last longer. And then, probably the most useful, honestly, is Heighten. Heighten is basically what allows you to use your spells in a higher spell slot. If you apply Heightened to a spell, you actually get to choose the effective level that you want to cast that spell at. So the level increase is whatever you chose to bring that spell to. So we can bring a level 1 spell all the way to level 9 if we so choose, or we could just bring like a level 4 spell to level 5, that kind of thing. This is important to understand because Heightened Metamagic is effectively raising the spell level of the spell that it modifies. So this actually will increase the saving throw DCs and its ability to penetrate
through spell resistance, all of that jazz is calculated with the higher spell level in mind. Then we have Maximize. Maximize is the stronger version of Empower. However, you can actually use both on the same spell. But Maximize will maximize all the numeric effects of a spell, besides the, of course, saving throws and opposed rolls to block the spell. Basically, it will just deal maximum damage. The level increase on this is +3, and if you maximize and empower a spell, it gets maximized first, and then you get plus half of the normally rolled result. So you don't get half of the maximized result, but you get half of the normal roll on top of the maximized. Then we have Persistent. This will give the spell the effect of whenever a creature is targeted by a persistent spell or within its area, succeeds on its saving throw against the spell, typically to reduce damage, etc., it is forced to make a second roll. If that creature fails the second saving throw, it still suffers the full effects of the spell as if it had failed the first saving throw. Basically, this forces enemies to re-roll their saving throw and basically force them to either succeed twice or fail. This will increase the level of a spell by 2, and obviously won't affect spells that don't require a saving throw to resist or lessen the spell's effects. Then we have Quicken. Quicken is very cool, but it comes at a high cost. Quicken lets you cast your spells as a swift action, meaning that you can cast the spell and then also do something else that same round, which would be your standard action, which could potentially be casting 2 spells in the same round, actually. Now, any spell that has a casting time of more than 1 round or 1 full round cannot be quickened. The level increase for this, though, is a solid +4, and casting a quicken spell won't provide an attack of opportunity to your enemies if you're in range, and that brings us to the Reach spell. The Reach spell will simply increase the reach of your spells. If it has a range of touch, close, or medium, you get to increase its range by 1 range category. So touch would go to close, close would go to medium, and medium would go to long. This increases the level of the spell by 1, and moreover, spells modified by this feat that require melee touch attacks will then require range touch attacks instead. And if you already have a spell with a range of long, you can't actually increase the range further with this. It only affects medium and below. And then last but not least, we have Selective. Selective is basically what allows you to not actually hit your friends with friendly fire when you're casting your spells, provided it has an area of effect and a duration of instantaneous. You can choose a number of targets in that area equal to the ability score modifier used to determine bonus spells of the same type. If you were a wizard, it would be your intelligence. If you were a sorcerer, it would be your charisma, etc. But the modifier on that is how many targets you get to protect, basically. And then they simply don't get hit by your spell, even if they are in the area of effect. Because if you're unaware, friendly fire is a thing, and if you fireball your allies, they will in fact get hit. So that is all the various types of metamagic, and now let's go into how to actually apply them to your spells, because it's fairly easy to miss. So when you're in your inventory and you bring up your spell book, which is where you will go to either memorize or look at the spells you know, because if you're a spontaneous caster, you don't of course have to memorize anything. You simply get a number of casts per day. But regardless of any of that, when you tab over to your spellbook, you'll want to find the Metamagic tab in the lower left corner. This is going to bring up the following menu. And the top left there, where we see all the circles, is all of the Metamagic you know, out of all of the ones available. Now to the right, just above our actual spells, if you know any Metamagic, you will then see little circles above your spells. These circles are the Metamagic you have applied, if any, to it. Moreover, these are also a good indication of how many metamagic things that are actually available to you if you have several. For instance, here you can see where we have 2 dots above some of them. That is because we only have 2 types of metamagic that could possibly affect that spell, and thus it only shows the applicable dots. But to the left here, if we drag over a spell, it will then open up the metamagic we could apply to it, and then we just click those. The white number on the red dot is the level increase that spell will take if we choose to apply that metamagic. Right below this, we of course see the resultant spell level. And then with the heighten metamagic, we of course get to choose the resultant spell level. And then below, where it says decoration, this is actually what will allow us to change the icon of the resultant spell, thus allowing you to, differentiate it on your hotbar. Now, once you click Write Spell, you can find this spell either in your favorites menu, which is the star spell level over there on the right, or it will now be in the appropriately leveled spell level selection that it resulted in after you got done with it. And then, of course, now that we cast this spell from now on, provided we choose the one that actually has the metamagic applied, it will cast it as that spell level with the appropriate metamagic. So there you go, guys. There is a look at how to use metamagic in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. In my experience, it's usually best to identify which metamagic you're probably going to be using the most. For instance, Heighten is very versatile, but in select situations, you might of course want to use something like Selective. But given the fact that it comes at a feat cost, if you don't have a rod to use in place of the feats, it is one of those things where it's best to have a plan. Hopefully, after seeing this video, you feel a little more confident in your understanding of what metamagic is and how to apply it in-game.
And as we move towards the end of the video here, we're going to be talking about how to cure common status ailments, which can be especially frustrating for new players who don't actually know what they need to do or how they need to do it in order to cure very common ailments that will affect your party. Though this is one of those things that difficulty will actually affect a lot. Something to keep in mind.
We're going to talk about the ones you're going to come across the most often, kind of ways to prevent them, as well as just straight up how to cure them, of course. But before we get into that, I do want to mention two things. For starters, every character has an ability called Treat Affliction. So every one of your party members will have this ability. What Treat Affliction does is makes a lore religion check and attempts to cure something. If you fail that check, which is based, again, off your lore religion skill versus whatever the difficulty class of the ailment is, it will either cure or fail to cure this illness. That's something just handy to know. Sometimes it'll work for you, sometimes it won't. Pretty inconsistent, just because of the nature of the check. Moreover, in every major hub, there is a cleric of some sort that will sell you scrolls. In the early parts of the game, this is a guy named Visely, I believe it is. In Act 1, he is at the tavern, and in Act 2, he is also at the healer's tent in your camp. Then, when you get to your main town hub, it actually switches to a person called Arsino, who is just outside of the temple as well. This is important because these are the people you will go see when you actually need a lot of these ailments cured, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. I just wanted to mention the location of these people in your town hub. So with that out of the way, let's actually jump into some of the conditions. First up, the obvious two, Death and Death's Door. Depending on the difficulty you're playing on, for starters, if you're on Casual and below, Casual or Story, all you got to do to cure basically everything is Rest, because on that difficulty, everything is removed on Rest. And then, if you are on, I believe it is Core or above, you don't see Death's Door at all, meaning that if your characters die, which is to say they take negative damage more than their Constitution score, they just die. Whereas if you have Death's Door on, you basically get a freebie where that character will have taken fatal damage, but instead be given a condition called Death's Door. Death's Door basically means you used your freebie, and if you die again, that character will be actually dead, which means you'll have to resurrect them. If your main character dies, it's just game over. But your companions and things can die and be resurrected, which brings us to Death. The way that you cure Death is the Raise Dead spell, or the Resurrection spell. Resurrection is just an improved version of Raise Dead. Raise Dead's kind of the minimum, which kind of just brings them back as they were, with barely a little sliver of health, whereas Resurrection brings them back fully healed, basically. Now, the primary way you're probably going to do this is scrolls. However, later in the game, it is possible to have party members who can cast Raise Dead. These are typically clerics or any divine caster who can potentially get these spells. But Raise Dead can be performed by a companion. However, otherwise, you'll go to one of these clerics in town, buy a Raise Dead scroll for 6,000 gold, and just have that character that is dead use it, and then ta-da, they're back to life. And then we have Blind. Blind is annoying, but very simple to cure. Blind is permanent, meaning that if your character failed a check against a blind status effect, like the spell Blind, they will be blinded. The easiest way to deal with this is, of course, go buy a Remove Blindness scroll, which has no checks of any sort. You just use the scroll and you're automatically cured. It is also possible to have the spell Remove Blindness on a companion as well, which can make this pretty easy to deal with. That brings us to Disease. Diseases are annoying. Now, if you're lucky, you can use Treat Affliction on them and get rid of them. However, diseases, once they've been caught, have a very high DC to actually remove with Treat Affliction. Otherwise, it might be more difficult to remove. These can be removed with a Remove Disease wand, a Remove Disease spell, or a Remove Disease scroll. However, just using the scroll is not good enough, which is what makes the disease effects really annoying, actually. So diseases are ongoing, where your character can either make certain saves to eventually be cured of it just over time naturally, but every so often, like a frequency per day kind of thing, that disease will make a check that then usually deals some sort of ability damage to you, which we'll get into next. And overall, they're very frustrating. In fact, on core difficulty, it's possible to get diseases you cannot cure at the level that you are simply because making the check is impossible. Because remove disease has a caster check associated with it, which is a d20 plus the caster level of the person casting the scroll or the spell, which will then go up against the difficulty class of the disease itself. It's possible to buy a remove disease scroll or use a remove disease spell, use it on someone with the disease, and not actually cure it, which can be incredibly annoying. But nonetheless, that's how you get rid of that one. Next up, we have ability damage. This comes in temporary and permanent. Temporary can typically be healed simply by resting. And then there is permanent ability damage, which requires a restoration scroll typically to actually cure. These can again be used as scrolls from the clerics or spells from your companions, but basically restoration is what you are looking for, which is why it's always handy to have scrolls of restoration or greater restoration just on you when you're out and about adventuring. Now, some of the other things restoration can cure is actually negative levels. Negative levels are very frustrating. If you take more negative levels than you have hit die, your character will just die outright. Speaking of, if your ability damage, if you take ability damage to one of your ability scores, that is to say your strength, constitution, etc., that brings that stat to 0, that character dies. Restoration can cure both of these things. Negative levels also come in timed and permanent variants. If it's timed, if it's a really short timer, you might just want to wait it out. However, if it's the 24-hour one or the permanent one, you're going to want to use a restoration scroll. However, in combat, that's not really good enough for negative levels because you can take so many very quickly and just die outright from the negative levels. So what's usually better to do in that case is use a spell called Death's Ward, which prevents negative levels as well as gives you a +4 to the roll against death effects. Now, if you catch a few negative levels from like a ghost or something, because ghosts and Nabasu tend to be the ones giving you negative levels, if it's just a couple, you can cure it with a restoration scroll. But if you're dying in a situation to negative levels a lot, the best scenario is usually to use Death's Ward so that character just stops taking them. And then that brings us to Curse. You don't see a lot of curses in Wrath of the Righteous, but occasionally they do come up. Very similarly to the disease effect, you can just buy a scroll or have someone use Remove Curse as a spell. That then makes a d20 plus the caster level check of the scroll or spell, and then it tries to remove the curse. Then there are poisons. Poisons can usually be removed by Remove Poison, or, of course, the Remove Poison spell. It is also possible to suppress their effects occasionally, but again, Treat Affliction can also be used here. But I would say, in my experience, once that character has been poisoned, it's usually too late until the actual poison effect stops, and then you cure the ability damage or something. Poison will usually lead to ability damage before it wears off, and you just have to make sure that character doesn't die from the ability damage, which is usually your main concern there. And then last but not least, I want to mention Confusion and Insanity. You see Confusion come up a lot above, I believe it's normal, like above normal. You'll start seeing the Vescivore swarms in Act 2 confuse your characters. Confuse itself isn't that bad. Basically, confusion will cause your character to make a roll, and then depending on the range of that roll, your character will perform one of a few actions. They might behave normally, it might attack itself, it might attack someone else, it might do nothing. But it's only got a very short timer, confusion that is. And then there is Insanity. Insanity is basically the permanent version of confusion. Your options here are basically Greater Restoration or the Heal spell. Insanity is rare. Typically what you're going to get is confusion, but occasionally a character can actually get insanity. And it's important to know how you can cure that if you don't just choose to reload that fight, because insanity is one of the more annoying ones. Because while that character can continue to travel with you, obviously they're going to behave very unpredictably. So that's one you want to deal with pretty quick.
That is pretty much going to wrap up our major points for this video, as we are approaching the 2-hour mark now, I imagine. But there are a handful of things that I do still want to talk about and mention. For instance, we haven't covered the Crusade mode or the Crusade management literally at all. And there are a handful of smaller systems we also haven't touched on, but in those particular instances, like resting and crafting, I actually think the game itself does a pretty good job of explaining those. And they're relatively minor and simple to comprehend. So I don't feel the need to bore people with their inclusion, frankly. Now, on the other hand, the Crusade and the Crusade management is a pretty major system. However, I'm going to link a well-done video by another content creator that covers that part of the game specifically, because he goes into a lot of detail and I think it's well done. But also, that part of the game is much different from the rest of the game, and as I mentioned in the difficulty section, it's actually very possible to turn Crusade auto mode on and just kind of not deal with it. So you really don't have to be all that involved in the Crusade if you don't want to, but the spark notes are that you actually lead the Crusade against the demons, hence the Wrath of the Righteous title, and you do this by generating troops, battling in sort of Heroes of Might and Magic style battles, and developing forts and towns, which will give you various benefits. If you turn Crusade auto mode on, it pretty much does this for you. Not quite as efficiently as you might, but nonetheless, that's how it gets done. Then from there's a handful of miscellaneous things that I wanted to mention here as well. For starters, don't freak out too much about making mistakes when it comes to character creation, as you can retrain your characters pretty much throughout the entire game. As soon as Act 1, you're able to retrain. So respecking is absolutely a thing, and feel free to use it. If you're on, I believe it's core or above, it will actually invalidate some achievements if you retrain, but beyond that, there's really no limit to it. And another thing is that I touched on it a little bit in the spellcasting section, and that is spellbook merging. So any full divine caster or full arcane caster can merge their spellbook with the angel and the lich mythic path spellbooks respectively. So if you're an arcane caster, the lich, and the divine caster is the angel. If you are a full caster of that type, meaning that you get your full 1 through 9 spell list. In those instances, you can merge your spellbook with the Mythic Path spellbook, and this will actually give you access to some incredibly powerful level 10 spells, and it is a very fun thing to do if you're playing a caster. However, it only really works with those 2 Mythic Paths. And then last but not least, before I leave you guys, the classes themselves. So one of the reasons it's kind of hard to talk about the classes individually kind of in depth is because truthfully there's a lot of redundancy in there, meaning that honestly you could cut a lot of those classes and it really wouldn't make a huge difference to the overall feel. A lot of them play the same way, a lot of them have very overlapping abilities. In some cases, some of them are just kind of useless. Off the top of my head, the Defender of the True World Druid as well as the Assassin Prestige class in particular are really bad. Primarily because the Defender of the True World Druid gets a bunch of bonuses against Fae, which just don't really make an appearance in this game at all, and that's a holdover from Pathfinder Kingmaker, where that was a thing. And then there's the Assassin Prestige class. This class, while thematically pretty cool, uses a lot of poisons to deal ability damage and potentially kill enemies that way. However, the issue with this is that most of the enemies in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous are immune to poisons. And there's no mythic ability or anything that will let you get around this like there is with casters and the Ascendant Element feat. And while I can tell people useful information like that, when you start looking at individual classes, you notice that if I go over each one individually, I'm repeating myself over and over again, saying essentially the same things with respect to certain mechanics. Like a lot of classes get sneak attack damage, and then I have to explain that and why it's different and how the levels work and how sneak attack damage scaling works. And that is a ton of incredibly overwhelming information for new players. And yeah, sure, a nerd like myself is all about it, but there comes a point where you have to realize you're just overloading people. And that's before we even talk about things like, again, mounted combat, animal companions, how their scaling works, the entire roster of animal companions, how they rank. Dog is surprisingly high, by the way. And while I do think those are great questions to ask, to my mind, when you're presenting that information to new players, I've found, and the approach that I've taken with this video is to lay down the foundations and let them arrive at those questions themselves. So they want to seek out that information so it's not so overwhelming and they kind of get it as they look for it. So I hope I made all of that clear, and I hope this honestly exceedingly long video still managed to be thorough enough to answer a lot of the basic questions and help any new players. Wrath of the Righteous is a game that honestly means a lot to me. It's a game that grew this channel exponentially. It's just a very big deal to me personally. So if I can help anybody understand or play this game more, then that is honestly a huge win for me. So to that mind, if you have more questions than this video answered, by all means drop them down in the comment sections below. If I do not personally answer them, I'm sure members of the community will, who are usually just as passionate about this as I am. But if nothing else, I promise you we can send you towards the appropriate resources to answer any more specific questions than the basics that were outlined here. But all of that said, truly, just thank you so much for watching, especially if you watched this entire video, as it was very difficult to make and took several days. But with all of that said, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.